Okay. Well, thanks all for being here. This is a fascinating way to talk about a book. Many of us don't know one another, which is fine. Perhaps other people will join in a couple of minutes. To start off with, I thought I would just tell you why this book, because, or at least from my perspective, why this book. And I'd love to hear if anyone had a chance to take a look at it. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with James Baldwin, certainly a notable American writer, novelist, and is, in his own words, a witness to the civil rights movement. The Fire Next Time was first published in 1962, actually. And so there's a question about why read this book now? Certainly there are any number of books, some of them classics, on race, but in my view, Baldwin is kind of unmatched as an interpreter of race in America, but also the way that race interacts with religion in America, which makes him a really interesting voice. And also, I think that in this book in particular, he presents a set of problems and questions and concerns that are, I think, quite relevant to our time today. In particular, a sense of what is the United States. So just so I have a sense, I know that not everyone has their camera on. Is there anyone here who had a chance to read some or part of or all of this book?
Finished the audio minutes ago.
Oh. I listened to the audio.
Oh, wonderful. Cool.
Audio,
so,
yeah.
That's great. Well, the audio is really good. And it's short. It's only, 2 hours and 20 minutes or so?
It's like 2.5 hours.
Yeah, exactly.
So, it's not that short.
Well,
it's very good.
It doesn't feel like that short when you're having to replay every 30 seconds.
Sure.
That's what he's saying. So.
Yes, indeed. Well, so I thought as I was planning for tonight, very stupidly, I thought I'll just pick like 2 passages and we'll just talk about those. And then as I went through sort of like putting Post-its in passages that I thought were important, I ended up with like 12. So we can't do that, obviously. But I figure what we'll do to start anyway is, so the book is comprised of 2 essays. One of them is a letter to his son, or to his nephew named James. And the next one is really a kind of profound engagement with the place of religion, Black identity and white identity, and what it means for America to be made up of Black and white people. So what I'll do, just to get us started, is I'm going to read a passage from the first essay, which is called "My Dungeon Shook," and I'm not going to give it context, but we'll just sort of go from there. And I think what we'll do is see if anyone has any sort of preliminary observations or thoughts or questions, and then see how our conversation progresses, and then just sort of jump around the book and converse with each other. Oh, there was one other thing I did want to say. I'm sorry, which is that I think the thesis of the book overall, if I could, is that there's a question being raised in the 1960s by especially the Nation of Islam, but it comes to be asked again in the Black Power movement, among Black Panthers. Are Black people properly American? Or is Black nationalism really the way to go? And Baldwin carves out a path that basically says, really, Black people are most American, and that white Americans really cannot be or know themselves unless they come to understand and appreciate and have a right relationship with Black Americans. And I'm kind of simplifying, but I think that that's perhaps a decent summary, and others who have read it may wish to chime in a little bit after I read this passage. So I'm going to begin. I'm sorry I don't have page numbers for you. I have a collected works of Baldwin that I'm reading from, and so if you have it in front of you, I'm sorry. Here we go. I'm just going to start right in the middle. I know what the world has done to my brother and how narrowly he has survived it. And I know, which is much worse, and this is the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I nor time nor history will ever forgive them, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives, and do not know it, and do not want to know it. One can be, indeed one must strive to become, tough and philosophical concerning destruction and death, for this is what most of mankind has been best at since we have heard of man. But remember, most of mankind is not all of mankind. But it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime. I'm going to stop right there because I think that's actually, I know it's really early in the book, it's only the second page, but I think it's one of the most important statements that he makes about race in America, that it's the innocence that constitutes the crime. I wonder if anyone who read it or heard it, any thoughts on that? Maybe what he possibly meant? Did that perplex anybody else or catch anyone else's attention in listening?
Yeah.
Chris, you're muted.
Hey, how about that? Better?
Yes.
It struck me as the same as it did as what I just finished, which was when he starts to talk about the tyranny of the mirror, right? Mm-hmm. And, I had a really hard time following. I understood what he's saying, but I'm still trying to process this idea of I can't understand myself until I understand the black man.
Yes.
Right? And I'm just going to throw that there because I'm processing that, and that is a really hard thing for me to get my mind around.
What do you find difficult about that?
I have always come from a place where understanding myself precedes being able to understand anybody else.
Uh-huh.
And that has flipped it on its head. And I'm not sure where to start on that.
Yeah.
And being somebody who cares about this, that's one of the things I find the most frustrating things when I think about race is, where do I even start? I can't find a place to start, right? It's like Archimedes, like, give me a place to stand, I can move the world. I cannot find that right now. Mm-hmm. In this context.
Well, I think in many ways that's part of why I started there, is that I think this touches on the basic insight that Baldwin has, which is that American society has been shaped by this particular relationality between white people and non-white people, but particularly between white people and black people, and that in the social hierarchy, those at the bottom reveal something very significant about those at the top that they don't know about themselves. And there's another passage that resonates with this as you're speaking. Go ahead.
Can you see me?
I can.
I don't know. Oh, okay. I don't really know. So based on what Chris said, mm-hmm. About that it feels natural to understand yourself in terms of yourself first. Mm-hmm. I may be getting this wrong, but I believe I have heard that a typical Western world view of things is I'm at the center of things, and a typical Eastern view of things is more I'm looking out the window and I'm not sure how to describe it, but it's like the converse. So if I have no idea what, there are race issues in other countries and continents, no doubt about that, but
sure,
I wonder if that is part of, and I have to confess I have not read the book, but if that is part of the issue, that we have this very self-centered culture. So I don't know.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
what Chris said, I think, is pretty natural for us here.
yes. Well, so I would, yeah. There is that, and then there's sort of more. I think what Baldwin is doing is suggesting something a little more pointed, which is that he says, for example, and I'm sorry I keep flipping around here, but he says there's this great statement about the Negro problem. He says, white people in this country will have quite enough to do in learning how to accept and love themselves and each other. And when they have achieved this, which will not be tomorrow and may very well be never, the Negro problem will no longer exist, for it will no longer be needed.
Mm.
So one of the remarkable things that he does is he identifies, I think, on a what we might call a psychological level, and says that the race problem in America largely has to do with a psychological need on the part of those in power, and this need is worked out among those who are disempowered. I don't know if that makes any sense. I know that that's a complex concept.
That makes sense.
It does make sense.
A similar passage, which I think is very helpful, is Can
I clarify something about that, Matt?
please.
So the psychological need, is that is it worked out among the people who are disempowered, or worked out upon or by using the disempowered people as a tool?
The latter. So, I mean, I ended up like over bookmarking this, which is really unhelpful. There's a section where he talks about the Black person as sort of the most reprehensible creature in America, which I think is extremely helpful in identifying. He effectively says that the Black person in America is the projection of all of the fears and anxieties of white people. Here we go. I found it. I thought I found it. I'm sorry. I did not. I apologize. There's a lot of overlap in the book, which makes it somewhat difficult to remember exactly where things are. Regardless, the point remains that he sees the Black person as, here we go, I found it. These tensions, that is, tensions between Blacks and whites, are rooted in the very depths as those from which love springs, or murder. The white man's unadmitted, and apparently to him unspeakable, private fears and longings are projected onto the Negro. The only way he can be released from the Negro's tyrannical power over him is to consent, in effect, to become Black himself, to become part of that suffering and dancing country that he now watches wistfully from the heights of his lonely power and, armed with spiritual traveler's checks, visits surreptitiously after dark.
He's sarcastic.
A bit.
Yeah, I mean, that was a section that I struggled with. In trying to really understand what he was saying there. I'm not sure I ever got there. But,
sure.
You know, and Father, going back to the first comment you asked us about, which was the innocent, the innocent is the cause.
The innocent constitutes the crime.
Okay.
Yeah.
The innocent. I thought it should have said naive constitutes the crime. And I think sometimes as I listen to it, I think, he writes beautifully, but I think sometimes he uses words in almost a sarcastic, cynical way to sort of jab us, to get us thinking. And that was just my feelings about that expression, about the innocent. Because I think if we said naive would be more accurate the way I see the world.
Yeah, I wonder if by innocent, part of what's going on there is the fact that most individual white people do not perpetrate acts of, say, violence against Black people, right?
Right.
Nor are they really exposed to those acts of violence. And so there's a sense in which we all live in a society where maybe we're not individually responsible or culpable for individual acts, and can claim a degree of ignorance and even a degree of innocence. Meanwhile, that very innocence is sort of a form of willful denial of the world around you. So that denial is precisely what allows the crime to be perpetuated. Precisely because most people will look the other way. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Conscious denial or subconscious unaware of it? Which do you mean?
I think both.
Ooh.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, I mean, let's, so here in Dallas, it's easy to remember and easy to forget that this is an immensely segregated city, and that there are people who suffer immensely in some parts of the city that, like, I never see. I live in a secluded little area, but one could simply ignore that. One could simply forget the fact that large swaths of the economy here, for example, have to commute into wealthier parts of the city for work, and then go back to what effectively are slums, and it's precisely our living denial of that fact. And I think part of it is not that it's mental. So I think the consciousness or unconsciousness is secondary to the behavior. We behave as though it's not the case. I don't know. Does anyone else have a comment or thought?
Well, can I talk?
Please.
Okay. I'm not too fluid with this Zoom format. So I do think there are two sides to that coin. One is, what you're kind of saying, that it's a conscious putting blinders on, but it's also part of the problem. But there's, I think, a lot to be said for out of sight, out of mind, and what you do not happen to come across in, fulfilling your needs, getting your groceries, and doing your job and going to school or whatever. What you don't come in contact with, you are kind of oblivious to. And I think that's a big part of the problem, that we don't have that, we're not exposed to South Dallas all the time. We don't have that interaction. So out of sight, out of mind, I think. So there's some of that too. And exposure to any kind of information or knowledge, whatever, is, I would think, a key to overcoming ignorance. But how do you get that exposure? I don't know. So,
well, on that point, Holly, and I don't mean to pick on what you said, but
that's okay.
You can take it a little bit. The immediate passage following the one that I read, the immediate paragraph, names something that I think is really relevant to that, to your remark, which is really helpful about this sort of out of sight thing. So he says, his nephew's name is James. He says, "Now, my dear namesake, These innocent and well-meaning people, your countrymen, have caused you to be born under conditions not very far removed from those described for us by Charles Dickens in the London of more than 100 years ago. I hear the chorus of the innocents screaming, no, this is not true, how bitter you are. But I am writing this letter to you to try to tell you something about how to handle them, for most of them do not yet really know that you exist. I know the conditions under which you were born, for I was there. Your countrymen were not there and haven't made it yet. Your grandmother was also there, and no one has ever accused her of being bitter. I suggest that the innocents check with her. She isn't hard to find. Your countrymen don't know that she exists either, though she has been working for them all their lives. And it's that last sentence that really captures, I think, the difficulty. So, for example, you know, I'm in a weird position, but so where Evie and I live is, by and large, an extremely white bubble in Dallas. It may well be the whitest of the bubbles that we have. And if we were to go across the highway to the grocery store, we would see mostly people of color as like cashiers. Or if we were to go to most restaurants, most of the kitchens and most of the restaurants where we go to are filled with Latin Americans, people that we maybe don't even notice. I think Holly just like disappeared on me. Anyway, I don't know. Does that resonate with anybody? This sense of sort of not seeing,
Definitely.
but there are people who are actually there who are not seen. It's not
Absolutely.
it's not just physical separation. There's also something more profound going on.
So Matt, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if this is similar. I think it's similar. I'm not sure it's the same thing, but you know, I grew up in a small rural East Texas town. Lived, you know, in the late 50s, 60s, I remember separate waiting rooms, separate water fountains, the whole 9 yards. I mean, all that was part of my life. And then in the mid to late 70s, after I finished college, the first place I lived was Boston. And I had never in my life experienced bigotry and racism growing up in the rural South that I saw when I lived in Boston. And and people said, oh, you're from Texas, you've got to, you're prejudiced. Well, I never experienced what I saw in Boston. And someone, I said that to someone, and their comment to me was, well, growing up in the South, we dealt with, and I'll use today's term, African Americans every day. So we respected them as individuals. In the South, the race was denigrated, but people in the South respected the individuals they interacted with. And the prejudice had come out, the prejudice and bigotry had come out in Boston, in the Northeast, and other places, when because of desegregation, where they had respected them as a race, they were then forced to deal with them as individuals, and they had never had to do that. And when they were forced to deal with the African Americans one-on-one, that became a problem for them. And I don't know, I mean, I may be getting off track, but to me, that strikes the chord there.
I think there's something there. I mean, I think one of the things that's really remarkable about Baldwin individually is that he's writing with particular view to his upbringing in Harlem, and that there's So a good portion of this book deals with his interactions with the Nation of Islam, with passing reference to Malcolm X. One of the most kind of remarkable things that one learns about the whole civil rights era is that in some northern cities, Martin Luther King Jr. had virtually no reception. In places like Chicago or Los Angeles, there's this one incident where King was in Los Angeles and was like shocked that some of the people there who were Black hadn't heard of him. He was sort of offended by this. Like, what do you mean you haven't heard of me? I'm King. But the cultural currency of the things that Malcolm X was saying was much more powerful in northern ghettos than in the South, precisely because of a very different manner of racism. And I think that's part of what you're touching on. And I think that's part of what Baldwin is dealing with is the issue of ghettoization, if I can, import a term that maybe he himself doesn't use too much. But the broader point, I think, still holds North and South, which is that in some way or another, white people in America have needed Black people. And I think, and it's not, and I don't mean like needed economically, but rather needed pathologically, right? That there's been some sense that in order for white people to form what it is to be white, they've had to have this underclass to define themselves against. I don't know. Somebody else who read the book, does that ring true of what the book is saying? Like Daniel, can I call on you?
Sure. Yeah, I think I read the book as having mostly, like, the thesis was that, I mean, it's found in the title, like, the fire next time is speaking to the judgment that is upon and is coming upon white America, but America as a whole, for the whole web of kind of pathological relationships we've created in which people cannot be honest about who they are because they've become dishonest about who other people are and what they deserve. And the big thing is, yeah, like, I don't know, coming up, going through school and all that, I feel like oftentimes it's so easy to define yourself as like, I'm better. I'm somehow better, whether it's through education, whether it's through economic status, or any of these things. It's so often easy to feel better, and you have to have someone to define yourself against. And yeah, I think he definitely speaks to that.
Sure. Justin, you raised your hand.
Yeah, so I think in the latter portion of the book, as in his conversation with Elijah Muhammad of the Nation of Islam, as you pointed out, there is the initial premise that's kind of proposed at the beginning of the book, where it's talking about how white America needs Black America in order to create a kind of a polar opposite of itself, that it may define itself, essentially, being that if you were to look at, historically into the past, if you look into Europe, where we ostensibly, where all the quote unquote white races would be coming from, when there was no other skin color of people there, at least within some areas, they didn't it didn't naturally define itself as white. They defined themselves based upon their geographic location and their tribal affiliations and all that kind of thing. However, when they were transported over to the New World and met with indigenous people, met with Black slaves, etc., that allowed for a defining of all of these mixtures of people from white Europe, essentially, to define themselves as a new form of white, which I think plays into the latter portion in his conversation with Elijah Muhammad, where most of the theology of the Nation of Islam is in defining its form of Islam against white people.
Yes.
If there was no existence of white people, there would be no Nation of Islam, essentially.
Yeah, and I think he wants to get past that, right? So I think one of the major, so to touch base with what Daniel had just said about sort of the title of the book, that the fire next time is the threat of what happens to America if white people and black people don't learn to be American, as I think the basic claim that he's making, that if white people don't stop defining themselves against black people, the country won't be what it can be. And I think what you've pointed out, Justin, is exactly the reason why he spends all this time on the Nation of Islam, is basically to come out and say, this is not really an option. It's not an option pragmatically, but more deeply, it's not an option philosophically either. It's not an option for human beings.
I think he's trying to get to a point that a formation of like black nationalism is falling into the same pitfall that white nationalism essentially fell into, which is especially pointed when he talks about how at that point the leader of the KKK donated a whole bunch of money essentially to I guess like the Back to Africa sort of movement.
That's right.
And it reminds me actually of another period of time slightly prior to this period, where there was basically a face-off between two other black leaders in the early 20th century, which was A. Philip Randolph and Marcus Garvey, essentially, where A. Philip Randolph, who was mostly working as a labor organizer, was more concerned with trying to integrate black workers into the broader labor movement, essentially, versus Marcus Garvey was looking towards a initial black nationalism, essentially, where they wanted to take all black people back to Africa in order to establish a new society there that was actually, which A. Philip Randolph would critique as creating the same exact oppressive structures which were in the United States for white people at that time.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and that's also King's critique of Malcolm X's own black nationalism. So there are kind of two directions I think we should go, or at least touch on. Can
I jump in real quick with one observation on the prior point?
Yeah, please.
So in terms of white people needing the black people, there's a sense there are many ways we can define ourselves, but one way is through our crimes, through our sins, and so I thought that he was getting at the sense that all of these crimes and sins remain potential until they are inflicted on someone, and it is the white person inflicting this on the black person that is giving them an identity that they don't have any other identity to cling to. And so in order to have a sense of self, in some sense, they need to hang on to this crime, as it were.
Maybe. I wonder. So there's this one sentence that stuck out to me. The Negro came to the white man for a roof and for $5 or for a letter to the judge. The white man came to the Negro for love. But he was not able to give what he came seeking. The price was too high. He had too much to lose. And the Negro knew this too. When one knows this about a man, it is impossible for one to hate him. But unless he becomes a man, becomes equal, it is also impossible for one to love him. The fact that he says that the white person has come to the black person to be loved is extremely fascinating to me. What do you make of that, Chris? Like, in conjunction with what you've said.
I think there's a dissociation in the white mind with how he sees himself and he sees his counterpart. He can't understand himself. And because he is coming from that perspective of trying to understand somebody else through understanding himself, he's not able to do that. And it sends him into a dissociation that has to be dealt with from the outside.
Okay.
Outside of himself. I don't know if I'm making myself clear at all.
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to need to think about that. Anyone else on that point? or Abigail, you got something?
I have a question about it. Yeah. So when he makes that assessment, that must have been at the end because I don't reckon. But
It's towards the end. Oh, you froze. Are you there? Nope. We'll come back to you when you're unfrozen. One of the things I wanted to touch on is the place of Christianity in this work, which I think is so vital to talk about. In many ways, Baldwin has an extremely negative view of the church and of Western society, which he identifies as Christian society, and he really identifies the United States as a Protestant nation, which I think is a question worth sort of or a claim worth probing. But I'm going to read a somewhat lengthy section, but I think it's important. The white man's heaven, sings a black Muslim minister, is the black man's hell. One may object possibly that this puts the matter somewhat too simply, but the song is true, and it has been true for as long as white men have ruled the world. The Africans put it another way. When the white man came to Africa, the white man had the Bible, and the African had the land. But now it is the white man who is being, reluctantly and bloodily, separated from the land, and the African who is still attempting to digest or vomit up the Bible. The struggle, therefore, that now begins in the world is extremely complex, involving the historical role of Christianity in the realm of power, that is politics, and in the realm of morals. In the realm of power, Christianity has operated with an unmitigated arrogance and cruelty, necessarily, since a religion ordinarily imposes on those who have discovered the true faith the spiritual duty of liberating the infidels. This particular true faith, moreover, is more deeply concerned about the soul than it is about the body, to which fact the flesh and the corpses of countless infidels bears witness. I'm going to skip ahead. Use these long sentences. Here we go. It is not too much to say that whoever wishes to become a truly moral human being, and let us not ask whether or not this is possible, I think we must believe that it is possible, must first divorce himself from all the prohibitions, crimes, and hypocrisies of the Christian church. If the concept of God has any validity or any use, it can only be to make us larger, freer, and more loving. If God cannot do this, then it is time we got rid of him. A very arresting statement. Any initial impressions of that? I have lots of thoughts about it, but I don't want to monopolize our conversation.
So I'll talk. I wasn't going to, but I will. I'm just to be transparent here. I'm an Episcopal priest also in Concord, Massachusetts. And I think that Baldwin's critique of the church and of Christianity is valid given his experience. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I've wondered about over the last year after a course that I took at Virginia Seminary, where a young Black professor said in my hearing to the other people of color in the room, you have to stop wondering why the white people don't love you. It's because they don't even love each other. And so I think the challenge for the church and the challenge for those of us here who identify as white and as Christian is, before we can even engage in this conversation about our relationship with people of color and the sin of racism in our country and the sin of racism in our church and all of that, is, are we actually loving the other people in our churches, no matter what color they are? Are we doing that? And I can say in this small group, in my church, We have a homeless person in my community, and the people in my church last winter when it was snowing didn't want me to house him in our church.
Oh.
You know, like it starts right in your community with the actual people in your community and in my community. So I think Baldwin has an excruciatingly pointed understanding of this issue, but as Christians, it's pretty basic. Like, you don't have to have a heady understanding of this. It's just, are we actually caring for one another to the point that we can even engage in a conversation about how we care for people who are different from us?
Yeah, I resonate with that quite deeply.
Very much.
Well, and I think he hits on something that I think is really important for the way we as Christians understand ourselves, which is, apart from an incarnation, he's absolutely right. God is absolutely useless. God not entering into this reality, there's no way we can make it work without that meeting. And it comes down to an understanding of how to recognize God's image. And I know you and I have talked briefly about this, this concept that, Christ assumed in himself everything about us that needed to be redeemed. Race and gender weren't things that he assumed for everybody. So is that something to look at? Is that something we can say is essential? And I think outside of an incarnation, outside of thinking about what is the nature that God assumed, I think Baldwin's absolutely right. Apart from that, yeah, God and religion is useless.
Yeah, I don't know if everyone grasped exactly what you said, Chris. I wonder if we could unpack that a little bit. So I can put it in somewhat contemporary context. Of late, just last week, in response to Black Lives Matter protests here in the U.S., the Archbishop of Canterbury acknowledged the value of re-examining images of Jesus that are white, right?
Yeah.
And said, like, yeah, this is somewhat of a problem. Jesus was not a white man. And I wonder, I don't know, is that enough of a prompt for you to kind of riff on that? And say something?
Yeah, I think we have this understanding that when Christ took on our nature, he redeemed every bit of that nature that needed to be redeemed. And there are things that are essential to that, and there are things that are accidental to it. And if we are going to say that Christ's work was efficacious for all of us, if it's as efficacious for me as it is for you, our skin color is not part of that. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, he would have to be reincarnated as a Black person, as a woman, as a South Asian, as a Sub-Saharan African, however it is. The fact that one sacrifice and that one instance of incarnation that covered all of humanity should make us think about what is essential.
Yeah, but okay, so let me play devil's advocate a bit.
Sure.
And sort of take on the critique of Christianity. I think part of what he's saying also is that he simply, I think, identifies Christianity with imperialism, right? He says the spreading of the gospel, regardless of the motives or the integrity or the heroism of some of the missionaries, was an absolutely indispensable justification for the planting of the flag. I mean, certainly that's a long-standing, that's an old critique, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's old now. Does that?
Yeah, I think part of that too is when Christians try to take salvation into their own hands, it goes off the rails so fast it'll make your head spin.
Yeah.
thinking that we are bringing something of ourselves to another culture that will save them.
Yep.
I think that's going to go bad really quickly. If it's actually bringing the gospel that has saved us, that's a different story, and that is effective.
So would you say, sorry, Chris, but would you say, I mean, I think part of the question here is Christianity, I mean, I think there's a set of questions. Is Christianity a white religion? Is, I think, an important question, certainly one that was pressing at the time in conversation with the Nation of Islam. I think there's a question of, is the United States a Christian nation? How does one make sense of America having a Christian legacy and also a legacy of white supremacy? The dissonance there is profound.
Very.
Well, I would say that the resolution of that is a realization that America is not a Christian nation, but it is founded on a Christological heresy, which is that race and salvation are intertwined somehow. And the more you become like the race that happens to be on top at the time, is how you affect your salvation.
Yeah, I wonder if that ties back in with what he said before, or what I read earlier, which he says later, about effectively that the white person has to become black himself to become part of that suffering. Is sort of the white person's salvation in a way that we could talk, I think, as Christians anyway, about the virtue of downward mobility, right? The not the race to the top, but the solidarity with the bottom. Oh, there's a cat.
She heard your voice.
That's exactly what happened. Yeah, I'm quite struck with this. I think for me, I mean, I'm a Christian priest. That much is a fact about me. It's a serious question, I think, for me to engage. I'll put it this way. I wonder, do you think my commitment to fighting against racism in the United States is at odds with my commitment to being Christian, or to being a full-fledged member of the church?
Matt, are you putting that out there? Or are you directing that to Chris?
I feel like it's
I'm putting that out.
Absolutely not.
Right.
I mean, as you were talking through this and Chris was talking through this, I mean, I think there are segments, and certainly for me, I see it today, there are segments of Christianity that use that. That doesn't mean that that's what Christianity is, at least in my mind. You know, that's not what the gospel says to me. Mm-hmm. And that's not what I was taught growing up. Even growing up in the rural South, that's not what I was taught. But there are segments back in the 60s and certainly prior to that and today that use that tried to turn Christianity into using that. And that's, to me, that's the struggle that we're in right now in today's world. I mean, you look at what Bishop Budd and the folks at St. John's Lafayette Square were trying to do and kind of bridge the gap, and how their own space was taken away from them by other people when they were trying to work with the protesters and be part of this movement. To me, that's what we should be about. So
I don't disagree with you, Fred, at all. I mean, certainly I was posing the question somewhat rhetorically. I mean, I think I don't think it's a coherent position as a Christian to I think the Christian embrace of white supremacy historically has been one of its great crises of credibility. I think that crisis of credibility continues to work itself out. I mean, I think part of what I'm going to restate what Chris was saying. I think part of the work, at least that church people have to do, is be willing to name the fact that Christianity that goes awry in this way is not Christianity. It's heretical.
Thank you. Yep. Yep.
Unmute you, Holly, or I guess you have to unmute yourself. Do you know how to? Can you unmute yourself? There you go.
There. Oh, no, I hope I can remember what I was going to say. I have a question about what you just said. You said the Christian embrace of, I may be misquoting this, the Christian embrace of white supremacy. And I kind of think it's more the opposite of white supremacy embrace of Christianity, say, as a justification for what they do. I don't know. I am.
No, I think that's really helpful. I mean,
the conversation is over my head, but and I lost power when you were slamming me over something.
Oh, I'm really sorry.
How ironic! I missed it. I'll have to watch that.
Yeah, it was epic. So I think what you're saying is important. I mean, I think there's a question here, which is like identifying Christian people versus Christianity, and I think this is a conversation that I end up having on like a weekly basis about whether Christianity is culpable for the misuse of Christianity, right? Because is Christianity indicted based on the behavior of Christians, right? Or self-identified Christians. And I think as a Christian, I have to say, Christianity the truth and value of Christianity does not stand or fall based on the behavior of people who call themselves Christians. If it did, Christianity would long have been disproven. It wouldn't have survived the century, right? I mean, I think Christian people behaved really badly from day 2. Let's be generous and give them day 1. I think that, I think that holds.
In some sense, original sin is necessary for Christianity to be true in its own. I mean, it's the happy fault, right? That made this necessary. If we can't acknowledge that there is an original sin within us, then the work of the incarnation is meaningless. And I think what you have when Christians embrace white supremacy or white supremacy embraces Christianity, whichever way it flows, and I think it probably flows both ways, it's a denial of there being an original sin that Christians themselves are culpable of.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to, say something about the historical, the origin of this. We can't just talk about it today. We really need to be looking at the origins of this country and how it was really founded in a way to justify slavery, and Christianity was used. The Bible was used to do that, and it was, there were some Christians and some leading Christians who probably didn't endorse it, but by far the broadest swath of Christians and ministers were very complicit in the whole white supremacist founding of the country. So it's not surprising that we still have that through line up to today. And if we don't think about that history, we might be surprised, but it's not surprising when we think about our history.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's really helpful. Thank you. And I think one of the things that I find disturbing about this book is his indictment of the Black church, because in many ways, like, one of the things that I would want to say is that Black Christianity has been a countervailing force throughout American history, that has been a witness against the misuses of Christianity by white supremacists. But what's so striking and so unsettling is his utter rejection of Christianity out of hand, as basically another form of enslaving people. And I think one of the questions that comes out of this, and maybe I'm putting this too sharply, and someone can correct me. And Abigail, I did see your hand up a minute ago, so I'll come to you in a second. But just the one way to maybe frame this is, I think he has in fact more faith in the American project than in Christianity, as like in the project of the church. If the church kind of alleges that it is a gathering of people from all nations and from all walks of life and all economic statuses and so on, he basically thinks that that's false. But he thinks that America doesn't have to be false, and I find that disturbing and partially objectionable. I mean, I think that one has to have some hope in the country in which we live, and I don't disagree with him. I think he's absolutely right that unless and until America sorts its race problem, America can't be America. It's always going to be at odds with itself. But I think broadly, I would also want to say, I think he's totally confused America and the church. Like, I think he believes that America is what the church claims itself to be. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, I think it does. Especially from the point of view, like, a lot of times over the last couple of years, and really time anything big comes up with immigration, people like to point out the Statue of Liberty and the poem that's at the base of the Statue of Liberty, give me your tired and your weary and weak, and all that stuff. But of course, as you say, like, if you just look at the actual history of the United States, that doesn't really bear itself out in practice. And so I think you're right. I think he is kind of conflating what America kind of says it wants to be, to a degree, like off in the shadows, as opposed to what Christianity professes itself to be, but like more willingly acknowledges that it fails at.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. Abigail, did you want to jump in? I feel like you missed your chance before.
Sure. I mean, this is different, but well, it's related. One of the questions I have thought of that's relevant to a number of these sort of diagnoses is I wonder who is supposed to recognize them as true diagnoses. You know, like if he gives a diagnosis and says, I don't know, anything about like what Christianity or what's going on in like white people's psychology, or what I kind of wonder, like, you know, at what point, I wonder who's supposed to be able to recognize it as true. Is it like everyone is supposed to sort of accept, oh yeah, of course that's true? Or is it like, you know, is Black readers who are to be able to say, yes, I recognize that, that's true? Or is it like,
yeah,
you know, so that's one question. And then it becomes relevant again when we begin talking about Christianity does this or Christianity does that. And when it's Christianity adopting white supremacy, I think in some cases it's, you know, patently true. And in other cases, you might have to, like, in order for it to make sense, to, you know, most Christians, or, you know, even me, it might need to be restated to be something like a certain version of Christianity either condones it or sort of renders it tolerable or invisible, or like tames it to the point that a Christianity that's sort of all about maybe individual salvation or, equality of guilt and, forgiveness freely available to all makes it very easy for people to ignore, and the stakes aren't really very high because I'm totally forgiven, and so if it's not my personal guilt, what's the point of trying to recognize it? So it seems like that version of Christianity it certainly isn't overtly white supremacist, but it certainly makes it very easy to be complicit, because that's one of the sins that's going to fly really easily under the radar.
Yeah. So I think, okay, so I mean, to your first point about recognizability and sort of like who recognizes this as true, I think that's a great question. I don't know that I'm the authority to answer it myself, but I would say I think when we deal with descriptions of relationships between people, one of the realities I think simply is that we recognize each other in we recognize each other and ourselves in the description. I mean, to me, as I this is not the first time I've read this book, and as I read it again, I was like, there's so much here to which I object, and there's so much here that I heartily affirm, kind of all at once, which is why I think it's a rewarding book to read.
The statement in particular that I was wondering is the one where that you mentioned, where he says, a black person came to a white person asking for $5 or a letter to a judge, and then a white person came to, white people come to black people for love, and I'm wondering, really?
Yeah. Well,
the thing about love,
yeah, I mean, I think that's something that black people,
but I'm not sure on do white people do that? I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. I think if in no other way, I think when white people come to black people looking for absolution in some way for white guilt, that's a form of looking for love. Right? I think there's a sense in which I think white Americans have a collective sense of guilt, where they know in some way that only black people can free them from the great collective debt that has accumulated as being white Americans. I don't know if that rings true. Chris, you look concerned.
I think it's deeper, and in some ways I feel a little slimier than that. I think about friends of mine, white people who will go to the black church for an experience and then go right back, and then 6 days a week they're in their bubble. They come to get their fix of the love, and it's almost it still is, I guess, a form of servitude that they're forcing on that. You're here to provide me with what I need. Mm-hmm. You're here to provide me with an experience, even a spiritual one. But then I can retreat from that, and I can call you my brother and my sister, and then and I will be civil to you if I see you on Wednesday, but there's not an engagement.
Yeah, I think there's something there. Daniel, did you have your hand up before?
Yeah, I just actually kind of wanted to read a passage that I thought kind of touched on your question of his sort of the legitimacy of his criticism of Christianity. And I'll just read it from my version. He talks about, he starts the book by talking about his experience kind of coming into the church and getting saved and all this. Then he goes into how he was trying to defend his faith to his Jewish classmates, and he says that they kind of dismissed him. He said that this might not have been so distressing if it had not forced me to read the tracts and leaflets myself, for they were indeed unless one believed their message already impossible to believe. I remember feeling dimly that there was a kind of blackmail in it. People, I felt, ought to love the Lord because they loved him, and not because they were afraid of going to hell. So, linking that with what you said earlier about the Nation of Islam minister who said that the white man's heaven is the black man's hell. In some ways, I think even though he might be using a line out of the Bible or a rephrasing of the line out of the Bible to sort of cast his entire argument, this is also a criticism of the doctrine of hell, which kind of links people's ultimate destiny and thus their sort of just deserts with any sort of history or behavior. So I think in some kind of way, you can actually just read this as a criticism of a certain form of Christianity. Although I think, I don't know if Baldwin himself would agree with that reading.
I think that's really helpful. I'm really mindful that we've gone past 9 o'clock, so I'd like to just conclude our time. I know we've only kind of scratched the surface of this book. I hope for those of you who haven't read it, you're intrigued enough perhaps to pick up this book and spend some time with it, or some of his other writings. I'd like to read just the concluding passage of this book, which is so moving, and then I'll pray for us. Here we go. I know that what I am asking is impossible, but in our time, as in every time, the impossible is the least that one can demand. And one is, after all, emboldened by the spectacle of human history in general, and American Negro history in particular, for it testifies to nothing less than the perpetual achievement of the impossible. When I was very young and was dealing with my buddies in those wine and urine-stained hallways, something in me wondered, what will happen to all that beauty? For black people, though I am aware that some of us, black and white, do not know it yet, are very beautiful. When I sat at Elijah's table and watched the baby, the women, and the men, we talked about God's or Allah's vengeance. I wondered, when that vengeance was achieved, what will happen to all that beauty then? I could also see that the intransigence and ignorance of the white world might make that vengeance inevitable, a vengeance that does not really depend on or cannot really be executed by any person or organization, and that cannot be prevented by any police force or army. Historical vengeance, a cosmic vengeance, based on the law that we recognize when we say, whatever goes up must come down. And here we are at the center of the ark, trapped in the gaudiest, most valuable, and most improbable water wheel the world has ever seen. Everything now, we must assume, is in our hands. We have no right to assume otherwise. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others, do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy recreated from the Bible in song by a slave is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water, the fire next time. Well, thank you all for a stimulating, if partial, conversation. I hope perhaps to do something like this again in the future. And maybe we'll just, in the future, select one particular passage and talk about it or something. But let me pray for you all and pray for us, and let you go to do your thing for the rest of the day. Let's pray. God, we thank you for the gift of the community that we have right here. We thank you for the gift of life and the gift of many witnesses that have come before us to tell us difficult truths and to force us to grapple with the world as it really is. We ask for the grace to open our eyes to see those around us, and the courage and the strength to do what you call us to do in this world, to leave a world that is better for those who come after us. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Father Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you so much, Father Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
It was
Take
very
care.
good.
Thank you.
Such
Good night,
a
everybody.
blessing.
Thank you.